Yesterday, we were talking about how India needs to learn and make changes to actually be able to build platforms and models and infrastructure for AI. Now, where are we going to learn all of this from? Well, from the models that already exist and the story that played out when actually building those models. So, I decided to do some reading, and I was reading about how ChatGPT came into our lives. Incidentally, I was reading on ChatGPT or how ChatGPT came to our lives. And it's a really interesting story, and I think it teaches us a lot about how AI happened to become something that each and every one of us uses so quickly, what this means in terms of world dominance, and what India could learn or what Indian builders could learn about where the future is going to take us. Okay, so this is my side quest today, where we're going to talk about the journey of OpenAI and ChatGPT, where it came from, how it started, how did it become what it is today, which is a verb more than a noun. So it's not just ChatGPT, it's replaced Google it with ChatGPT it and figure out how to use it. And it's crossed weirdly into that threshold where we're no longer treating it like a program like we did to Google. We're treating it like a person. I met someone just yesterday who said that I treat ChatGPT like my South Indian boyfriend. I call him Chitranjan Gangadharan or something like that. It was really funny. So people are now talking to ChatGPT like it is a person that they know, that they're overly familiar with. And that, of course, opens a different can of worms. But we're going to leave that can for later. Today, we're going to talk about the journey of how OpenAI and ChatGPT actually happened before it came into our lives and for how long it was being worked on. So remember, like, share, subscribe, sign up for our membership if you find this interesting. Share the video with others as well. Give us that like button. It helps actually push this up in the algorithm on YouTube, and more people will see it on their homepage, and that's actually what pushes the video forward. All right, so OpenAI was founded in December 2015. So it's been around, for a while, even though we've had it in our lives for a very short period. Now, at that time when it was founded, artificial intelligence was still largely academic papers. It was research. It was in research labs. It had very narrow commercial applications per se. So the founders of OpenAI, who were Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Ilya Sutskever, I hope I said that right, Greg Brockman, John Schluman, and a couple of others, they were not responding to a consumer demand. So this was not about, we need to build a product that people will use. They were actually responding to fear. So unlike how a lot of startup founders say, hey, this is a problem that exists in the market or a gap that exists in the market, and we need to create a product that fills that gap, and that's how we're going to make a lot of money. That's not what this was. They were responding to a fear that artificial general intelligence or systems that are capable of thinking like human beings are actually going to emerge at a very large scale. And when they do, they will be controlled by a very small number of very powerful profit-driven corporations, which will have very little incentive to actually do public safety or democratically be accountable to the human race. And so OpenAI was created as a counterweight to that possibility. #irony, right? So basically what these guys were doing is they were sitting in Silicon Valley and saying, okay, we're looking at what is happening in the labs and the academic papers about AI. It's coming, and what's going to happen is that the big guys who already existed at that point in the tech space, the big guys are going to control it, and they're not going to be motivated because they're private sector profit driven. They will not be motivated to actually serve the human race. They will not be motivated to be accountable to human beings. They will only be after profit. So let's create an open AI space that will counterweight that. That's where that actually came from. So it began as a not-for-profit organization committed to open research. That is why it is called OpenAI. Ta-da! Committed to open research transparency with an explicit promise that artificial intelligence will be developed in a way that benefits the entire human race. It was an idealistic vision, obviously, but from a business perspective, it doesn't seem like it was a very practical one. So that was the founding. Now, years of research went into it. For the first several years, OpenAI did not resemble a startup in the traditional sense. There was no app, there was no subscription model, there was no path to revenue because they didn't need to. It was, remember, not for profit. What there was instead was just expensive and expansive research as to what AI will actually be able to do. So they were training large language models. There was enormous amounts of computing power that it needed, specialized hardware. Some of the most sought after scientific talent in the world had joined them. And this was not software development in the conventional sense. It was closer to building a scientific infrastructure. So imagine they were, it was a poor analogy, okay, guys? So the purists don't jump in the comment section. Or you could, because that will increase my interaction in the comment section. But the analogy is, imagine if you had just like a greenfield country with no roads at all, and you decided that you would soon need to drive your cars around. You start building roads from scratch, right? So you are putting a crisscross network of roads all over the country where no roads exist at all. That's what they were doing. They were building a brand new infrastructure. And between its founding, and this is the important part, between its founding in 2015 and a restructuring, and I'll get to it, that happened in 2019, so it's 4 years, OpenAI apparently burned $300 million. And there are some estimates that actually take that up to $600 million in 4 years in research, with zero plan for any sort of return on that money, return off that money, or any sort of revenue. Of course, we don't know what the exact number is because it's a not-for-profit, so it didn't need to publish any annual financials. There were no quarterly disclosures, but we know that the money was coming from research grants and from, and in order to just compute, and it was being spent on talent and on infrastructure. And there was little to show to the outside world other than research papers and experimental models that fully were never understood. Internally, it was becoming clear, though, that the original not-for-profit structure was not able to sustain what this research actually needed. Something had to change because it was guzzling and it wanted more. It wanted more money for more infrastructure. That's when 2019 happened, when OpenAI actually made a very controversial decision. It abandoned its not-for-profit structure. It flipped into a for-profit structure, into a sort of a capped profit entity, saying that, okay, this is the kind of profit, and it allowed itself to raise private capital while still claiming to limit investor returns. So at the same time, it entered into a deep strategic partnership with Microsoft, which invested billions of dollars and became OpenAI's exclusive cloud provider. The move sparked a lot of criticism. People said that OpenAI has betrayed its founding principles. It effectively handed over control of humanity's most powerful AI systems to one of the world's largest corporations. It's exactly the opposite of what it set out to do. Supporters actually said that without this pivot, OpenAI would have collapsed under its own costs. It would have never been able to sustain, and it would have never become what it is today. And so it needed the money. And I suppose if you examine it now with hindsight, both arguments are technically true. But what happened basically, it was true that AI was no longer an ethical debate. It was also an economical debate at this point. It was about economics. It was about feasibility. It was about money. I want to take like a minute here because obviously we live in an environment right now. You can't say Microsoft without someone saying Bill Gates, like that. So let me tell you. So Bill Gates was not personally involved in negotiating the Microsoft deal with OpenAI because at this point he had already, he was no longer hands-on running the company. But his sort of vision was still really important to Microsoft. So at the time that Microsoft invested billions of dollars in OpenAI, Bill Gates was not actively running the company, but his world view that AI is going to be the next thing was firmly in place. Now, this is also the time, slightly before actually, in the year preceding this big change, Elon Musk exited the company as well. And Elon Musk had a philosophical disagreement that predated the Microsoft deal. Musk believed that AI posed existential risks and should be developed openly, cautiously, and without profit incentives. Musk left the OpenAI board in 2018, so a year before Microsoft came in. Basically, he said that there were concerns about control, about pace, about conflicts. At that point, Tesla was also working on its own AI ambitions, so there was a conflict there. But once Microsoft came in, the split, then Musk leaving became cemented, or was basically set in stone, because then Musk could never come back after that, and it opened up that commercial path. Now let's take a look at, all right, so we've gotten up to 2019. There's a lot of money that's come in from Microsoft. What happened then? They developed ChatGPT, and it was released in November 2022. So technically, the human race has had ChatGPT now for a little over 3 years. One of the most misunderstood aspects about ChatGPT's rise is that it was never intended to be the kind of world-changing product it became. Apparently, that was a big surprise to the to the guys inside of, OpenAI as well, to the men and women who were working on it. ChatGPT was released and it was positioned as a research preview. It was meant to sort of just test the waters and see how people interact with it, and if it's possible for this really complex research large language model to interact with a regular human being who is not a scientist in a lab. A simple conversational interface, it was supposed to be, designed to test how people interact with large language models, to collect feedback and make those models safer. So they basically, again, I'm giving you a very base level analogy, okay, with that disclaimer. So they had basically designed this program that was going to do something, and they wanted to send it out to interact with a few people, to see how it does, to see how the people do, and to see if the model can learn from those interactions. That's what it was meant to be. And what followed took the world by surprise, because within days of that release, ChatGPT attracted millions of users. It just became a cultural phenomenon within weeks of being released. Teachers, students, programmers, lawyers, doctors, artists, everybody started using and experimenting simultaneously, discovering new cases that it can be used in. And OpenAI themselves had not even imagined that this is what it would be used for. So it had not invented this, ChatGPT did not invent those large language models. What it did is basically, it found a way to allow that large language model to talk to regular human beings, make it understandable, make it accessible, and immediately useful to ordinary people. And that bridge, as soon as that bridge was built between what was happening in the labs and regular human beings like you and me, artificial intelligence reshaped our lives. Now, again, I want to take a pause here to explain how ChatGPT actually works. So what does it do? Okay, so imagine if you had an assistant who was extremely well read but had never lived life. So never stepped out of the room and never actually touched the grass, breathed the air, or lived any aspect of life. So it has no personal learnings of its own. What ChatGPT does is that it learns from patterns what the next word should be. So for example, when you're typing and there's a prompt that finishes your sentence, so imagine that on a massive scale. So autocomplete. So if I were to ask you, if I were to type the capital of France is, the word Paris automatically comes next, not because you know the answer, not because ChatGPT knows that to be the answer, because countless times across the internet, across written word and spoken word, Paris always follows these words. The capital of France is, the next word will almost always be Paris, and that's the learning where that comes from. It's a pattern. So ChatGPT answers actually one word at a time, asking itself effectively what is the most likely next word to come here based on the patterns that I'm already seeing in the world. What makes it feel smart is memory. It remembers everything that you said in the conversation, so it can adjust its tone, it can explain things in a way that you understand, it simplifies, it's able to respond from memory to the things that you have responded to. So human trainers guide it. So remember, there are lots of cases where ChatGPT will give you two answers and ask you which of these two answers do you prefer. So every time you say, okay, this is a better answer, this is a more helpful answer, it learns. So it's not a thinking brain. What it is a powerful pattern spotting machine for language. And that is why it sounds so confident and so helpful. And also that is why in many cases it's wrong and the answer that it gives you is wrong. Now, hopefully that made sense. And if it didn't, then give me your explanation of what ChatGPT does in the comment section. Okay. Now, as the base obviously exploded across the world, so did the scrutiny, because now it was no longer, a bunch of people in a lab trying to figure this out. It was changing the way people live their lives. And there was a lot of scrutiny. The system was criticized because it was hallucinating facts, it was reproducing biases, enabling plagiarism, not giving credit to the people who actually created the work that it was learning from, and threatening entire categories of art and work. And governments began to intervene. In Italy, for example, it banned ChatGPT over data protection concerns. Lawsuits were filed by writers and artists, you'll remember. Publishers, media organizations raised alarms. OpenAI itself, the tensions reached breaking point, because you'll remember in November 2023, Sam Altman was abruptly removed as CEO from the board, only to be reinstated later. So what was happening here is OpenAI was no longer just a research lab or a tech company. It had built infrastructure. It was sort of like building all of the airports all at once, and everybody was suddenly using it. We made this company a permanent fixture in our lives. And I want to take a pause here to talk about that Sam Altman thing that I brought up. So between 2023 and 24, there were a few whistleblowing controversies that happened. One of those flashpoints happened basically because there were questions about governance, transparency, and safety. So in November 2023, OpenAI's board abruptly sacked the CEO, Sam Altman, saying that he had not been consistently candid with the board. So basically, he's not sharing enough information with the board. And within days, the entire OpenAI staff threatened to resign. Microsoft publicly backed Altman, and the board had to reverse its decision, reinstate him, and sack themselves. They all resigned. And it was a really dramatic episode. It revealed basically that OpenAI was it was a lot of money obviously riding on it, extremely dependent on the CEO and on Microsoft, and the board actually didn't have much power or say. The controversies deepened because Jan Laik and Ilya Sutskever departed the company, and they basically said that there's a huge issue with the safety culture, that safety was being deprioritized in interest of rapid releases of shiny products. There was another problem where an OpenAI former researcher, Sujit Balaji, 26, was found dead in his San Francisco apartment in November 2024, a month after he publicly raised concerns about OpenAI practices and he'd been mentioned as a potential witness in a copyright lawsuit involving the company. But the San Francisco police had since then basically said that he died by suicide, and they found no evidence of foul play in their investigation. So that was that case. ChatGPT fundamentally basically became, like I said in the beginning, a factor in all of our lives. An invisible, imaginary friend who's always there to answer your questions in a way that you find comforting. Interestingly, there were issues where people started treating it like a shrink, and it's not qualified. And so it gave people disturbing information. There were cases in which it has been accused of coaching self-harm and suicide and not flagging issues that it had received. And so there were many issues that developed around 2024, 25. But what makes ChatGPT fundamentally different from any sort of previous customer technology is its cost structure. Every single interaction, and we think that we've paid like a subscription, but every single interaction requires expensive and expansive computation, and a scale that is of running these large models is basically, it is still burning billions of dollars per year, being able to give you the answers that you're constantly asking it for. In reality, this has enormous implications. So artificial intelligence rewards scale, capital, and ownership. It favors those who can afford to build and maintain these large systems, and who are able to burn a lot of money for a very long period of time, waiting for that last aha moment, and those who are not looking for immediate sort of improvements or immediate evidence of success. It also punishes late entrants who lack the resources to compete, which is where India is currently sitting. So in a sense, AI is not like early internet or like mobile apps. It's sort of like energy infrastructure or aerospace. So basically, the first person who moves and builds the airport now has the airport. And if you didn't move fast enough, then, all you are left doing is taking the flights and, aiding the business of the person who built the airport. As ChatGPT is adopted by millions of people around the world, OpenAI gains more popularity, but it also gains structural power. Because every time you ask it a question, it becomes more powerful. Every interaction, it helps it understand how humans actually use artificial intelligence, what works, what fails, what people expect from their system. There's a powerful feedback loop that's constantly working. So basically, now that it is already here, it has already been adapted, it is very difficult for anybody to crack in and, become a me too. I can offer this at a lower cost because every time you ask ChatGPT a question, it has learned faster. And so it's learning faster than anyone else who can come after it. So ChatGPT has become the default interface for writing, reasoning, coding, problem solving. It has stopped being just an app. It starts functioning like infrastructure, making it hard for users and businesses to stay away. So once it becomes part of your system, you can't unplug from it because it has learned too well. It's sort of like having a best friend for 25 years and then being faced with the prospect of replacing that person with a new friend. Like, why would I ever do that? Because now we've built this relationship. And this is what is going to happen, not just with individuals and businesses and artists. It's going to happen with entire governments who are going to be using these sort of structures to do their direct benefits, to do their healthcare, to do their large data modeling. And these relationships will be built locking out any new entrants or developers and enterprise who build on top of OpenAI systems, increase that dependency, increase the lock-in. And regulators tend to trust large established platforms that can afford compliance. So this widespread adoption basically has given it massive data, it's given it massive capital, and has caused its influence to compound. All right, so basically the big lesson that we have learned from this ChatGPT story is that this was not an inevitable success. It was a success that was purchased. It was bought with years of financial failure, with scientific uncertainty, some ethical compromise, and private capital that was deployed at a historic scale like we had never seen before. So it actually brings us to an uncomfortable conclusion, which is that if you are not willing to fail expensively for a very long period of time, you will not own the future, you will only rent the future. And that's the problem that India is facing. So if there were 4 things that we were to learn from ChatGPT story to apply or to learn to modify the Indian structure, is that 1, we need years of losses before success. And India has always been tilted towards short timelines, predictable returns. Like the money that comes in for our startup industry from VCs from across the world is always chasing trends. It's always chasing a proven sort of method of return. And that is not going to work in this case. In OpenAI's case, it was the willingness to fund failure for many, many years that has actually reached the success that we're looking at today. Talent is not enough. In India, we have tremendous talent, but that is not enough because you also need long-term strong capital, which in some cases needs to be guaranteed by government in order to keep the best talent in your shows. Otherwise, they're going to be building for somebody else, as we have already seen it happen. And of course, like OpenAI has pointed out, the not-for-profit system has not really worked. And so you need hard choices about funding, governance, controlled deployment, and infrastructure that need to be answered quickly because we're running out of time. And finally, not only does, and I pointed this out, that OpenAI at this point is learning much faster than anyone who will now join the race, but it has also become part of the conversations in governance and policy and global standards. So if any government, and most governments now are trying to figure out how they want to regulate AI usage, data usage, privacy usage, OpenAI is at these tables, part of all these conversations, because that is the influence that they have built. So they become part of deciding global standards, and that's a really important influence to have. Fundamentally, hesitation is not on our side. We need to figure out where this capital is going to come from and how we're going to build. And how we're going to learn from the examples, even though these examples now are more than a decade old. Fundamentally, I do want to understand from you, though, what you think is standing in India's way. If, is it who we are as a people in terms of, are we too socialist, and we can have a separate video about that? We're not capitalist enough, or is it a question of where the capital is going to come from, because we have so many hungry bellies, tummies to feed, and so we don't have the actual resources to deploy to something like this, and where this will lead, in the future. So Leave me a comment in the comment section of what we can talk about, and let me know what you thought of this video as well. Thanks for watching.